They gathered in that quiet garage, laughter echoing as if rehearsed. His words, cold, cutting, cut through the hush. A rusted old van? That's your inheritance? They believed it worthless, a cruel joke, but she didn't laugh. Behind her eyes was something they couldn't see: grief, uncertainty, and a flicker of unspoken hope. She turned the key in the ignition, and the engine coughed to life, dragging with it the weight of a life lost, the final gift of a man she barely understood. To everyone else it was scrap metal, a mockery. But she felt faintly that this was no ordinary vehicle. Something lay buried, hidden, waiting, and by the time the truth revealed itself, it would change everything they thought they knew about family, trust, and inheritance. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Martha, a woman in her late 50s who had just buried her husband, James, a man she believed had left her with little more than memories and that rusted old van. And then there was Richard, her brother-in-law. He wore arrogance like a second skin, mocking her in front of the family as he leaned against the garage wall. To him, that van was nothing but scrap metal, a pitiful inheritance that confirmed what he had always believed, that Martha had been left with nothing of value. But he was wrong. What Richard could not imagine was that the van he laughed at would soon be at the center of a mystery that would tear apart everything he thought he knew. It wasn't just a van. It was a secret carefully hidden in plain sight. Why was this van worth millions? How far would greed push a family once the truth was uncovered? And most of all, who would be the one to finally reveal what James had hidden inside his last gift to his wife? These were the questions that transformed a quiet inheritance into a storm of betrayal, suspicion, and loss. To Martha, it was the final connection to her husband's life, a memory she was determined to protect. To Richard, it became an obsession, a symbol of wealth that was so close yet just out of his reach. But the van was more than a machine. It was a vault of secrets, heavy with the weight of gold, and its revelation would destroy more than just trust. The truth didn't just destroy a van, it destroyed lives. Martha had never asked for much out of life. She lived simply, worked quietly, and believed in loyalty above all else. Her marriage to James had been steady, if not extraordinary, and though their home was modest, she carried herself with a dignity that never depended on wealth. When James passed unexpectedly, Martha was left alone in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, and with a single possession that seemed to mock her grief, the old van James refused to part with. To outsiders, it looked worthless, corroded by years of weather and neglect. But Martha never questioned why James guarded it so fiercely, why he never allowed anyone, not even her, to touch it. She only assumed it was sentiment, a man clinging to the past. But that assumption was wrong. James had not simply been clinging to memories, he had been protecting a secret. James had always been a man of unusual habits. He spent countless nights in the garage tinkering long after everyone else had gone to bed. He locked the doors, kept tools neatly arranged, and never tolerated intrusion. Family assumed it was his escape, perhaps the way he coped with stress or loneliness. But there were whispers too. Suggestions that James's past was more complicated than he ever let on. Before settling down, he had worked in industries that dealt with heavy machinery and even mining, though he rarely spoke about those years. It was that history, those years unspoken, that would eventually come back to haunt the family he left behind. Richard, Martha's brother-in-law, had always carried himself with the air of a man who believed the world owed him more. He prided himself on appearances, on possessions, on being the one who had more than the next man. When James died, Richard showed little compassion for Martha's grief. Instead, he focused on what she had inherited, or in his eyes, what she hadn't. To him, the old van was laughable, a final insult to a woman he had never truly respected. At family gatherings, his remarks carried a sting meant to humiliate. "That's what James left you? A rusted tin can? The words were intended to reduce Martha's dignity, but instead, they foreshadowed his own downfall. What no one knew was that James had been hiding something in plain sight, inside the very van Richard ridiculed. It was during a family gathering, only weeks after James's funeral, that Richard finally revealed the full weight of his contempt. Surrounded by cousins, nieces, and old friends, he raised his glass and smirked at Martha. His voice, sharp and mocking, cut through the room. "To James," he said, pausing for effect, "a man so generous he left his wife with a rusted old van, scrap metal and broken memories." The laughter that followed was uneasy, but Richard thrived on it, his words deliberate, meant to humiliate. Martha lowered her eyes, silent, holding back tears. That moment, that cruel toast, marked the beginning of the fracture. The tension did not fade. In the weeks that followed, Richard pressed Martha relentlessly about the inheritance, demanding she sell the van, urging her to admit that James had left her nothing of value. But the arguments were more than just words. They carried with them an undercurrent of suspicion. Richard began appearing at her home uninvited, lingering in the driveway, his eyes fixed on the garage. Twice Martha came home to find the lock on the garage scratched and tampered with. One night, a neighbor reported seeing someone circling her property under the cover of darkness. And then, one evening, as the wind rattled the trees outside her home, she heard it. Faint noises near the garage. Heart pounding, she stepped to the window and stared into the darkness. And there it was, looming like a silent sentinel, the van James had left her, waiting, as if guarding a secret it could no longer contain. It happened on a cold evening when the world outside Martha's home seemed to stand unnervingly still. The sound that woke her was not the soft rattle of wind against glass, but the violent crack of metal being torn apart. Rushing to the garage, she found the door wrenched open, hinges twisted and broken. The space inside was empty. The van James had guarded all his life, the very van Richard had ridiculed with cruel laughter, was gone. The police arrived, notebooks in hand, their tone dismissive. To them it was a simple theft, a stolen vehicle from a widow who had nothing else. They could not imagine that this was the beginning of one of the most bizarre mysteries they would ever encounter. Scraps of paint left near the broken garage door were collected for analysis. Days later, the results came back with something unusual. Metallic traces embedded deep within the van's weathered surface, the kind not normally found in standard automobile construction. Old documents discovered in Martha's attic revealed fragments of James's life she had never known. Records of his work in remote mining operations, lists of equipment, and coded notes that hinted at shipments never declared. The deeper they searched, the clearer it became that James's old habits were not merely quirks of a man who loved his garage. They were the carefully guarded actions of someone hiding a secret too large to share. News of the stolen van spread quickly, and soon the headlines carried bold, sensational words. The Golden Van Mystery. Reporters gathered on Martha's street, neighbors whispered, speculation ran wild. Some insisted it was the work of random thieves. Others pointed fingers at Martha herself, whispering of insurance fraud and hidden motives. Even Richard joined the chorus, suggesting Martha had staged the theft to cover her embarrassment. But beneath the noise, detectives began piecing together something far more extraordinary. And then, the investigation took a turn. The police discovered the van's true nature, but it was already gone. The investigation reached a breaking point when forensic specialists examined fragments of the van recovered after the theft. What they revealed stunned even the most experienced examiners. Beneath the corroded surface, hidden under decades of carefully applied paint and rust, the body of the van had not been made of ordinary steel at all. Instead, it was solid gold, cast, shaped, and disguised so masterfully that to the casual eye, it looked worthless. For years, James had protected what was, in truth, a rolling vault worth tens of millions. As documents resurfaced and experts pieced together James's past, the shocking truth unfolded. During his years in remote mining operations, James had quietly smuggled small amounts of gold, concealing them in ways only someone with intimate knowledge of machinery could accomplish. Over time, piece by piece, he constructed his most extraordinary secret. A vehicle disguised as ordinary scrap, its panels layered with gold. The van wasn't just transportation, it was a lifetime of hidden labor, a treasure chest on wheels that no one, not even Martha, had ever suspected. When Martha heard the truth, the weight of it nearly crushed her. The van she thought represented memory and sentiment had carried a secret her husband never trusted her, or anyone with. It was not just the shock of the gold that broke her heart, but the realization that James had lived and died without ever sharing his burden. While Richard seethed with greed at the thought of what had been stolen, Martha wept. All she had wanted was to preserve her husband's legacy. But now that legacy had been revealed for what it truly was, a golden fortune hidden under rust and shame, a secret that fractured a family and changed the course of her life forever. As the investigation deepened, suspicions began to shift. Financial records and phone calls exposed a disturbing truth. Richard had orchestrated the theft of the van. He had hired men to watch Martha's home, paid off criminals to force open the garage, and carefully planned the disappearance of James's final gift. In court, the evidence left no room for doubt. The jury listened as the betrayal was exposed, step by step, until Richard's greed stood naked for all to see. The courtroom was a theater of fractured loyalties. Martha, trembling yet resolute, spoke of James and the years of silence she had endured. Richard lashed out, accusing her of selfishness, of withholding what should have been shared. His voice cracked with desperation as the weight of his actions closed in around him. Yet even in victory, the outcome was cruel. Much of the van had already been melted down and dispersed on the black market. What remained were only fragments, enough to prove the story but not enough to restore what had been lost. Martha was left not with millions, but with memories. She walked out of that courtroom with no fortune, no golden inheritance, and no van to preserve. What she carried instead was a bitter lesson carved into her heart. James had hidden his secret in gold, but Richard had revealed a deeper truth, that greed could dismantle trust faster than time itself. The story of the van was never about wealth alone. It was about loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of secrets kept too long. Gold may build wealth, but greed destroys families. And now, the question remains for you. What would you have done if you inherited this van? Would you have hidden it away, guarding it as James once did? Would you have sold it, risking the consequences of exposing its secret? Or would you have trusted family with the truth, no matter how dangerous that choice might be? Tell us in the comments what you would have done, and subscribe, because the next story might just change the way you see your own inheritance.